What if everything you believed about your enemy was shattered by a single meal? Picture this. December 12, 1944, deep in the heart of Wisconsin, at a place called Camp Wheeler. The air is sharp with winter, the ground frozen solid, and a line of German prisoners of war, women not soldiers, stand shivering in the mess hall, their faces hollowed by weeks of hunger and fear. Among them is Edeltroud Richtor, a young radio operator who hasn't tasted a real meal in over a month. She's bracing herself for the worst, expecting the kind of cold revenge she's heard about in stories, punishment rations, starvation, maybe even cruelty. After all, that's what she would have expected for enemy prisoners back in Germany. But what happens next is something no one in that line could have predicted. Instead of a thin, watery soup or a crust of stale bread, Edeltraud is handed a plate so full it nearly spills over. The food is steaming golden and topped with crispy breadcrumbs. The American soldier behind the counter, a stocky man with a broad Midwestern accent, grins and says, "Tuna casserole, good stuff, my ma's recipe." He doesn't look at her with hatred or even indifference. There's a strange, almost cheerful warmth in his eyes, as if he's serving neighbors at a church potluck, not prisoners of war. For a moment, the entire line freezes. The German women stare at their plates, unable to move, unable to believe what's happening. Is this a trick, a test, some kind of cruel joke before the food is snatched away? The silence is broken only by the sound of one woman gasping, her shock echoing through the hall. The American, still smiling, gestures to the pot behind him. "There's plenty more," he says, "if anyone wants seconds." Seconds. The word hangs in the air like a miracle. In that instant, everything these women thought they knew about their captors, about America, about the rules of war is turned upside down. The enemy, it turns out, is not a monster. He's a farm boy from Minnesota, raised to believe that no one should ever leave the table hungry. And the food, simple, hearty, and impossibly generous, becomes more than just a meal. It's a message, a challenge, and a lifeline all at once. This is the story of how a single plate of tuna casserole in a snowy American camp forced a group of German women to question everything they believed about war, about enemies, and about the true meaning of humanity. And as you'll see, what happened inside those mess hall walls would echo far beyond the end of the war, changing lives and even American history in ways no one could have imagined. But the real shock was only just beginning. The mess hall at Camp Wheeler was nothing like the German prisoners had imagined. For weeks, hunger had been their constant companion, a gnawing ache that dulled their senses and sharpened their suspicions. In Germany, food had become a distant memory, rationed into near oblivion by a war that seemed to swallow everything. But here, in the heartland of the United States, the rules were different. The moment Edeltraud Richtor and her fellow prisoners stepped into that American mess hall, they entered a world that felt almost impossible. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Rich, creamy, and unfamiliar, it drifted through the air, making their empty stomachs twist with longing. The sight that greeted them was even more surreal. Row after row of tin plates piled high with steaming tuna casserole, the kind of meal that would have been unthinkable back home. The portions were so large, so generous, that the women could hardly believe their eyes. In Germany, even soldiers rarely saw so much food in one place. Here it was being handed out to prisoners, enemies, without hesitation. Edeltraud's hands trembled as she carried her plate to the nearest table. Around her, the other women moved in a daze, their faces a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. Was this some kind of American trick, a psychological game meant to break their spirits? Or was it possible that this was real, that their captors truly meant to feed them like honored guests instead of defeated foes? No one dared take the first bite. The silence in the hall was thick, broken only by the soft clatter of utensils and the distant hum of American voices. Then slowly, one woman lifted her fork and tasted the casserole. Her eyes widened in shock and tears began to stream down her cheeks. The flavor was rich and comforting, the noodles soft, the sauce creamy and warm. It was a taste of home, but not the home they had left behind, a new kind of home, one built on unexpected kindness. As the first bites were taken, the mood in the room shifted. Suspicion gave way to something like hope, fragile and uncertain. The women ate slowly at first, savoring every mouthful as if afraid the food might vanish if they finished too quickly. But the Americans kept coming, refilling plates, offering seconds, even smiling as they served. The message was clear: here in America, even prisoners of war would not go hungry. For Edeltraud, the experience was almost too much to process. She had grown up hearing stories about American cruelty, about the dangers of falling into enemy hands. Yet here she was, eating better than she had in years, surrounded by abundance that seemed to defy the very logic of war. The casserole was more than just food, it was a symbol of everything she didn't understand about this strange, powerful country. The shock of abundance was not just physical but psychological. It forced the women to confront their own beliefs, to question the stories they had been told about America and Americans. How could an enemy be so generous? How could a nation at war with Germany show such compassion to its prisoners? The questions swirled in their minds, unsettling and profound. As the meal ended, the women sat in silence, their plates empty but their thoughts racing. The American soldiers cleared the tables with the same easy friendliness, chatting among themselves about baseball, home, and the upcoming holidays. For the German prisoners, it was a glimpse into a world they had never known, a world where food was plentiful, where kindness was possible, even in the midst of conflict. The shock of that first meal would linger long after the last bite was taken. It was the beginning of a transformation, a crack in the wall of fear and hatred that had defined their lives for so long. And as they left the mess hall that day, one question echoed in every mind: if this is what America is really like, what else have we been wrong about? But the story of hunger and hope in Camp Wheeler was only just beginning. To truly grasp the impact of that first American meal, you have to understand what hunger meant in wartime Germany. For Edeltroud Richtor and the other women at Camp Wheeler, hunger wasn't just a physical ache, it was a shadow that followed them everywhere, shaping every decision, every hope, every fear. In the final years of World War II, food in Germany had become a weapon wielded not just by the enemy, but by their own government. Ration cards were supposed to guarantee survival, but as the war dragged on, those cards became little more than scraps of paper, promises that could not be kept. Edeltraud's memories of home were filled with the smells of her mother's kitchen, fresh bread from the local bakery, hearty stews simmering on the stove, the comfort of a full table. But by 1943, those memories felt like dreams from another life. Butter was a luxury, meat a rare treat, and even potatoes were sometimes impossible to find. Her mother learned to stretch a single egg across 3 days, to make soup from potato peels, to turn scarcity into survival. Every meal was an exercise in creativity and sacrifice. For many young women like Edeltraud, joining the military wasn't just about patriotism or duty, it was about survival. The promise of regular meals, even if they were simple and bland, was enough to lure thousands into the ranks of the Women's Auxiliary Corps. The military rations were better than what most civilians could hope for, and for a while that was enough. But as the Allies advanced, even those rations began to dwindle. Supply lines broke down, and the communications unit Edeltraud served with was forced to move constantly, always one step ahead of the front lines, always hungry. Hunger became a constant companion, a silent enemy that wore them down day after day. Some days all they had was weak coffee and a handful of dried peas. The gnawing emptiness in their stomachs became normal, something to be ignored if they wanted to keep functioning. It was a test of endurance, a battle fought not with guns or bombs but with willpower and desperation. When Edeltraud and her unit were finally captured near the Belgian border, there was a strange sense of relief mixed in with the fear. The fighting was over, at least for them, but the journey to America was another ordeal. The transport ships that carried them across the Atlantic were cold and crowded, the food barely enough to keep them alive. Thin soup, hard bread, and the ever-present ache of hunger. By the time they arrived at Camp Wheeler, their bodies were weak, their spirits battered, and their expectations shaped by months of deprivation. That's why the abundance of the American mess hall was so shocking. It wasn't just the size of the portions or the richness of the food, it was the idea that, in this place, hunger was not a weapon. In the United States, even in a prisoner of war camp, food was plentiful. The American soldiers serving them didn't see hunger as a tool for punishment or control. They saw it as a problem to be solved, a need to be met, no matter who was sitting at the table. For Edeltraud, this realization was both comforting and unsettling. It forced her to confront the stark differences between the world she had left behind and the world she now inhabited. In Germany, scarcity was a fact of life, a reality that shaped every aspect of existence. In America, abundance was the norm, and even the enemy was fed with a generosity that seemed almost impossible to believe. The contrast was more than just physical, it was psychological, even spiritual. It challenged everything Edeltraud thought she knew about war, about enemies, about what it meant to be human. Hunger had been used to divide, to punish, to control. But here, in the heart of America, food became a bridge, a way to connect, to heal, to remind even prisoners that they were still people. As the days passed, the women at Camp Wheeler began to realize that the rules had changed. Hunger was no longer their master. In its place was a new kind of uncertainty, one that would force them to question not just their captors but themselves. And as they sat down to each meal, the memory of hunger lingered, a reminder of where they had come from and a warning of how easily abundance could be turned into a weapon. But the real test was still to come. Because in America, the next lesson wasn't just about food, it was about what it means to be seen, not as an enemy but as a human being. The journey that brought Edeltroud Richtor and her fellow prisoners to the heart of America was a story in itself, a story marked by fear, exhaustion, and the unknown. When the American forces finally encircled their communications unit near the Belgian border, surrender was the only option left. Their commanding officer, his face lined with fatigue and defeat, made the call to lay down arms rather than see his team destroyed in a hopeless last stand. For Edeltraud, the moment was surreal. The war, which had consumed every waking moment, suddenly fell silent. The guns stopped, the shouting faded, all that remained was the uncertainty of what came next. The Americans processed the prisoners with a kind of brisk efficiency that was almost shocking in its lack of cruelty. Weapons were collected, identification checked, and the women were loaded onto trucks. There was no shouting, no violence, just a businesslike routine that felt strangely impersonal. For women who had been taught to expect the worst from the enemy, this was the first hint that the stories they'd heard might not be the whole truth. But the real ordeal began with the transport ships. The Atlantic crossing was a test of endurance that pushed every woman to her limits. The ships were cold, the bunks cramped, and the food, if it could be called that, was barely enough to keep them alive. Thin, watery soup and hard, stale bread became their daily fare. The constant rocking of the ship, the endless gray horizon, and the knowledge that they were being carried further and further from everything familiar made the journey feel endless. Hunger gnawed at them, but so did fear. What would America be like? Would they be paraded as trophies, punished for the crimes of their nation, or simply forgotten in some distant camp? When the ships finally docked on American soil, the women were exhausted, hollowed out by weeks of deprivation and anxiety. The landscape that greeted them was nothing like the war-torn cities of Europe. Instead, they saw wide-open spaces, endless fields, and the kind of quiet order that seemed almost alien after years of chaos. The train ride to Camp Wheeler took them deeper into the American heartland, past small towns and farms dusted with early winter snow. For many, it was their first real glimpse of the United States, a country that until now had existed only in propaganda and rumor. Arriving at Camp Wheeler, the women braced themselves for the worst. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by soldiers, but there was none of the brutality they had feared. Instead, they were met with a kind of cautious curiosity. The American guards watched them, but not with hatred. There was a sense of order, of rules being followed, that was both reassuring and unsettling. The barracks were simple but clean, the beds narrow but covered with real blankets. It was not home, but it was not a prison in the way they had imagined. The first days in the camp were a blur of routine and adjustment. Roll calls, medical checks, and endless paperwork filled the hours. The women clung to each other, speaking in hushed German, trying to make sense of their new reality. The American staff, led by Captain Ruth Gallagher, maintained a strict but fair discipline. There were rules, but there was also a sense of decency, a belief that even prisoners deserved to be treated with a certain level of respect. For Edeltroud, the most jarring difference was the absence of fear. In Germany, fear had been a constant companion: fear of air raids, of secret police, of hunger, of betrayal. Here in the middle of Wisconsin, the fear began to fade, replaced by a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, survival would not require the same daily sacrifices. The American guards were not friends, but they were not monsters. They enforced the rules, but they did not go out of their way to make life miserable. The mess hall, with its rows of tables and the ever-present smell of food, became the center of camp life. It was here that the women first encountered Corporal Franklin Mills, the man whose approach to feeding prisoners would change everything. Mills was a stocky, cheerful presence, his Minnesota accent unmistakable. He treated the women with a kind of easygoing respect, never raising his voice, never showing the contempt they had braced themselves to endure. The shock of that first meal, of being served not just enough food, but more than enough, was a moment none of them would ever forget. It was the first crack in the wall of suspicion and fear that had defined their lives for so long. In that mess hall, surrounded by the abundance of American food and the unexpected kindness of their captors, the women began to realize that their journey was not just a passage from one country to another. It was a journey from fear to hope, from scarcity to abundance, from enemy to human being. But as the days passed and the routines of camp life settled in, new questions began to surface. What did it mean to be treated with dignity by the very people they had been taught to hate? How could they reconcile the generosity of their captors with the suffering of their families back home? The answers would not come easily. But in the heart of America, far from the battlefields of Europe, the seeds of transformation had been planted, and nothing would ever be the same again. And as the winter deepened outside the barbed wire, inside Camp Wheeler, the real story was just beginning to unfold. If there was one thing that set Camp Wheeler apart from every other place Edeltroud Richtor had known, it was the unmistakable stamp of the American way. From the moment she arrived, she sensed it in the smallest details: the way the guards tipped their hats, the way the camp commandant spoke with a calm, measured authority, and most of all, the way food was treated as something sacred, not just a necessity. In America, even in a prisoner of war camp, there was a sense of order and abundance that felt almost unreal to someone who had survived on scraps and ration cards. At the heart of this new world was Corporal Franklin Mills, the man who ran the camp kitchen with a philosophy that seemed to come straight from the heartland. Mills was a product of rural Minnesota, raised on a dairy farm where his mother's kitchen was always open to neighbors, travelers, and anyone in need. "No one leaves my table hungry," she used to say, and Franklin had carried that lesson with him all the way to the Army mess hall. To him, food was more than fuel, It was a statement of values, a way to show respect even to those considered the enemy. The kitchen at Camp Wheeler was nothing fancy, but to the German women it was a marvel. Industrial stoves, shelves stacked with canned goods, sacks of flour and potatoes, and the ever-present aroma of something hearty simmering on the stove. For Edeltroud, it was a daily reminder that she was living in a country untouched by the devastation of war. American abundance was on full display, and it was impossible to ignore. Even the simplest meals, scrambled eggs, oatmeal, thick slices of bread with real butter, felt like feasts compared to what she had known. But it was the attitude behind the food that truly set the camp apart. Mills refused to serve the bare minimum. He argued with his superiors, insisting that the women needed real nourishment, not just enough to survive but enough to heal. "Sick prisoners mean more work for everyone," he told Captain Gallagher, "and my mama taught me better than that." With her approval, he began to requisition extra supplies, determined to run his kitchen the way he believed was right. The result was a mess hall that became the heart of the camp, a place where the rules of war seemed to bend, if only for a moment. The women were served the same meals as the American soldiers: tuna casserole, beef stew, mashed potatoes, and on special occasions, pies that tasted like home. The portions were generous, the flavors rich, and the message unmistakable: in America, even prisoners deserved dignity. For the German women, this was a revelation. They had expected punishment, deprivation, maybe even cruelty. Instead, they found themselves treated with a kind of everyday decency that was both comforting and confusing. The American soldiers who worked in the kitchen: Mills, Private Zimmerman, Sergeant Armstrong, were not the monsters of propaganda. They were young men from small towns, more interested in baseball scores and letters from home than in exacting revenge. The impact of this approach was immediate and profound. Suspicion began to fade, replaced by a cautious trust. The women started to meet Mills's eyes in the serving line, to offer shy smiles and halting words of thanks in English. The mess hall, once a place of silent endurance, became a space where laughter and conversation slowly returned. Food, it turned out, was a language everyone understood. But the American way was about more than just full plates. It was about the belief that even in the midst of war there were lines that should not be crossed. The Geneva Convention was more than a set of rules. It was a reflection of American values, a commitment to treating prisoners with humanity. For Edeltroud, this was perhaps the most shocking lesson of all. In a world where cruelty had become routine, kindness felt revolutionary. As winter deepened and the snow piled up outside the camp, the warmth of the mess hall became a lifeline. The women began to recover, their cheeks filling out, their eyes regaining a spark of life. The food nourished their bodies, but the respect and decency nourished something deeper: a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, the world could be different. Yet beneath the surface, questions lingered. Why were the Americans so generous? Was it a strategy, a way to win hearts and minds, or was it simply who they were? The answers were not always clear, but the impact was undeniable. In the heart of America, far from the front lines, the rules of war were being rewritten, one meal at a time. And as the days passed, the women of Camp Wheeler would discover that the true power of the American way was not just in what was served on their plates, but in the possibility of transformation, forgiveness, and a future they had never dared to imagine. Thanksgiving arrived at Camp Wheeler with a chill in the air and a sense of anticipation that was impossible to ignore. For most Americans, the holiday meant family gatherings, laughter, and tables groaning under the weight of traditional dishes. But for the 28 German women held behind barbed wire in rural Wisconsin, it was a day that would forever change their understanding of America and of themselves. The announcement came unexpectedly. Captain Ruth Gallagher, the camp's commanding officer, gathered the women in the recreation hall and, through a translator, explained the meaning of Thanksgiving. "It's a day when Americans give thanks for their blessings and share a feast with family and friends," she said, her voice steady but kind. "Tomorrow you will eat the same meal as every American soldier and every American family: turkey with all the fixings." The words barely made sense. A feast for prisoners? The women exchanged bewildered glances, unsure whether to believe what they were hearing. In Germany, holidays had become grim reminders of what had been lost: empty tables, rationed bread, and the ache of hunger. The idea that their captors would share a holiday meal with them seemed almost impossible. But the next morning, the impossible became reality. The mess hall was transformed. The air was thick with the scent of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and sweet potatoes glazed with brown sugar. Corporal Mills and his kitchen crew had worked since before dawn, determined to create a meal that would do justice to the American tradition. The serving line was a parade of abundance: golden turkeys carved into thick slices, mountains of mashed potatoes, green beans topped with crispy onions, cranberry sauce that gleamed like rubies, and baskets of soft, white rolls. At the end of the line, pies, pumpkin, apple, pecan, waited, their crusts perfectly golden. Edeltroud moved through the line in a daze, her plate growing heavier with each new addition. Around her, the other women whispered in German, their voices trembling with disbelief. Some struggled to hold back tears. For a moment, the war felt far away, replaced by the warmth and generosity of an American holiday. When everyone was seated, Captain Gallagher stood and raised a glass of cider. "In America, we begin Thanksgiving by saying what we're grateful for," she said, her words translated for the group. "I'm grateful that the war in Europe is nearly over. I'm grateful that we can observe the rules of civilized warfare even in these difficult times, and I'm grateful that we can share this meal together." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Wilhelmine Lang, who had barely spoken since her arrival, was the first to break. She managed only a few bites before her fork clattered to her plate and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Around her, others followed, overcome by the sheer kindness of the gesture. For the first time in years, they were not just surviving, they were being celebrated, even if only for a day. The Thanksgiving feast marked a turning point in Camp Wheeler. The mess hall, once a place of silent endurance, became a space where barriers began to crumble. The American soldiers noticed the change immediately. The German women no longer approached the serving line with suspicion or fear. They met Mills's eyes, offered shy smiles, and even attempted English phrases: "Thank you, good, more please." The simple act of sharing a meal had done what months of rules and routines could not. It had made enemies into people. The kitchen became a place of quiet collaboration. Wilhelmine, who had grown up helping in her family's bakery, asked if she could assist with the cooking. Mills, curious and open-minded, agreed. Soon she was teaching him how to make German dumplings while he showed her the secrets of American casseroles. Other women joined in, sharing recipes, stories, and laughter. The language barrier faded in the face of shared purpose. Food became their common language, a way to connect, to heal, and to remember who they were before the war. For Edeltroud, these moments were both comforting and bittersweet. She found herself drawn to the kitchen, eager to learn, to help, to be part of something that felt normal. She watched as American and German traditions blended together, creating dishes that belonged to neither country in both. Apple pie met strudel, sauerbraten shared the table with pot roast. In the warmth of the kitchen, the lines between enemy and friend blurred, replaced by the simple truth that everyone everywhere needs to eat. The transformation was not just in the food but in the women themselves. Their cheeks filled out, their eyes brightened, and their laughter returned. The mess hall became a place of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, kindness could break through. The American way, generosity, respect, and the belief in second chances had done what guns and fences never could. But as winter deepened and the holidays passed, new challenges would arise. The women of Camp Wheeler had tasted American abundance, but they would soon be forced to confront the realities of a world still at war. The lessons learned over shared meals would be tested in ways they could never have imagined. And as the snow fell outside the camp, the story of transformation, forgiveness, and the power of food was only just beginning. As the Wisconsin winter deepened, the women at Camp Wheeler found themselves caught between two worlds. Inside the mess hall, the warmth of American abundance was undeniable. Outside, the snow fell in heavy silence, a reminder of the distance from home and the uncertainty that still shadowed their futures. For a brief moment, it seemed as if kindness and comfort might be enough to heal the wounds of war. But the arrival of the first letters from Germany shattered that fragile peace. The mail came through the International Red Cross, each envelope a lifeline to a world that felt impossibly far away. Edeltroud's hands shook as she opened her letter, the paper thin and worn from its long journey. Her mother's words were careful, shaped by the knowledge that censors would read every line. "We are managing as best we can," she wrote. "Your father's ration card allows us 150 grams of bread daily. We are fortunate compared to many." The Hoffmans next door lost their youngest to pneumonia last week. The doctor said malnutrition weakened him too much to fight the illness. "I think of you constantly and pray you are safe." Edeltroud stared at her breakfast plate: scrambled eggs, toast with real butter, oatmeal sweetened with brown sugar. She had eaten more in a single meal than her parents received in an entire day. The realization hit her with the force of a blow. The abundance that had once felt like a miracle now seemed almost obscene. Around her, the other women read their own letters, their faces reflecting the same dawning horror. Katha learned that her elderly parents survived on potato peels and whatever they could coax from their small garden. Hannelor's letter reported that her younger brother, just 14, had been pressed into service with the Volkssturm, Germany's desperate last defense force of children and old men. The guilt was overwhelming. They were prisoners, yes, but they were eating better than their own families, better than most civilians in Germany. Every bite became a reminder of what others lacked. The women gathered in the barracks at night, speaking in hushed voices about the impossible burden they now carried. Wilhelmine, who had found joy in the kitchen just days before, now questioned whether she had any right to enjoy cooking while her family starved. "How can I smile over apple pie when my mother is eating grass soup?" she whispered, her voice breaking. But the true reckoning came with the news from the outside world. In April, American newspapers began publishing photographs from the liberated concentration camps. Captain Gallagher, believing the women had a right to know, allowed them access to the reports. The images were almost too much to bear: emaciated survivors, piles of bodies, the evidence of starvation used as a weapon. The articles described how prisoners in places like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau had been deliberately deprived, given only a few hundred calories a day, forced to scavenge for scraps just to survive. Katha read aloud from one article, her voice hollow. Prisoners received 200 calories daily. Many survived on grass and potato peels scavenged from garbage. Death by starvation was common and expected. The room fell silent. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Here in America, they were offered seconds, encouraged to eat until they were full. There in the camps, people had been starved on purpose. The women were shaken to their core. Bridget ran from the library and vomited in the yard, her body rejecting not food but truth. Matilda sat motionless for hours, tears streaming down her face as she stared at a single photograph. That evening, the mess hall was quieter than ever. Edeltroud sat before a full bowl of beef stew, unable to take a bite. Wilhelmine pushed her plate away and spoke in halting English, her voice raw. "You feed us good, you feed us like people. My country made people into skeletons on purpose, made them eat grass while we ate bread. I did not know, but I should have known. I should have asked where the food went, who was hungry, why we ate when others starved." Corporal Mills sat across from her, his usual cheerfulness gone. "You were lied to," he said quietly. "Your whole country was lied to." But the words felt hollow. Being lied to was not the same as being innocent. Ignorance was not the same as blamelessness. The women understood with terrible clarity that every time they accepted a second helping, they proved that food was never truly scarce. The cruelty had been a choice. Abundance existed, but it had been denied to some and given to others. The guilt was a weight they would carry forever. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, the women of Camp Wheeler faced a new reality. The kindness they had received in America had opened their eyes, but it had also forced them to confront the darkest truths about their own country and about themselves. The story of Camp Wheeler was no longer just about survival. It was about reckoning, about the price of ignorance, and about the power of truth to change even the most deeply held beliefs. And as the world outside the camp shifted toward peace, the women inside would have to decide what to do with the knowledge they could never unlearn. As the snow melted and the first hints of spring crept into the Wisconsin air, the women of Camp Wheeler found themselves standing at a crossroads. The war in Europe was drawing to a close, and rumors of Germany's impending surrender swirled through the camp like a restless wind. But for Edeltroud Richtor and her companions, the end of the war brought not just relief, but a profound and painful reckoning. A reckoning that would haunt them long after the gates of Camp Wheeler swung open. The revelations of the past months had left the women changed in ways they could barely articulate. The letters from home, the photographs of the concentration camps, the realization that they had eaten well while others starved, these truths pressed down on them with a weight that no amount of American kindness could lift. Every meal in the mess hall became a silent confrontation with their own complicity. Every generous portion was a reminder that abundance had always existed, but had been weaponized by those in power. The question that haunted them was simple yet impossible. What would they say when they returned home? How could they explain the reality of Camp Wheeler to families and friends who had suffered so much? Would anyone believe that the enemy had shown them more humanity than their own leaders? The fear of being labeled traitors or collaborators was real. In post-war Germany, stories of American generosity would be met with suspicion, even anger. The truth was too complicated, too uncomfortable for a country desperate to rebuild its own narrative. One evening, as the women gathered in the barracks for what would be one of their final conversations as a group, Edeltroud finally voiced the question that had been building inside her. "When we return, what do we tell people about this place? About how we were treated?" The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing on every heart. Brant, always the most outspoken, answered first. "We tell them the truth, that Americans fed us better than our own government fed its citizens, that our enemy showed us more humanity than our leaders showed to millions. We tell them that abundance was always possible, that hunger was a choice, that cruelty was policy." Her words were sharp, edged with anger and sorrow. But Hannelore, the youngest, shook her head, fear in her eyes. "If we say these things, we'll be called traitors. People will say we were corrupted by the Americans, that we betrayed our country. They won't want to hear that the enemy was kind. It makes everything too complicated." Katha, ever the teacher, stood and addressed them all. Then we must be complicated, we must carry this complexity back with us. Yes, we will be uncomfortable. Yes, people will not want to hear what we have learned, but we owe it to those who died in the camps, who starved while food existed, to refuse the simple stories that made such horrors possible. Wilhelmine added her own conviction, her voice steady. When I cook again in Germany, every meal will be a memorial. I will feed people generously because Corporal Mills taught me that feeding your enemy is more powerful than starving them. I will remember that hospitality is not weakness but strength. Elle spoke last, her words carrying the weight of decision. We cannot undo what was done, we cannot bring back the dead or erase our country's sins, but we can refuse to forget what we learned here. That full plates can be offered without conditions, that enemies can become human through shared meals, that abundance should never again be weaponized through its denial. The conversation lingered long into the night, each woman wrestling with her own guilt. Her own hope, her own vision of what the future might hold. The lessons of Camp Wheeler were not easy ones. They were lessons about the dangers of blind loyalty, the power of small acts of kindness, and the responsibility to speak the truth even when it is painful. As Victory in Europe Day arrived and the camp prepared for repatriation, the women packed their few belongings and said their goodbyes. Captain Gullug explained the process. They would be transported to displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to their homes. The Red Cross would help them find their families if any remained. But the real journey was just beginning. The journey of carrying the truth back to a country that might not want to hear it. The journey of living with the knowledge that, in the heart of America, they had discovered a different kind of strength, a strength rooted not in power or victory, but in compassion, generosity, and the simple act of sharing a meal. And as the gates of Camp Wheeler finally opened, the women stepped into an uncertain future, forever changed by what they had learned in a place they never expected to find humanity. The moral reckoning of Camp Wheeler would echo through their lives, a reminder that the lines between enemy and friend, cruelty and kindness, are never as clear as we want them to be. But for Edeltroud and her companions, one truth would remain. In America, even in the darkest days of war, they had found a light that could not be extinguished. When the gates of Camp Wheeler finally opened, the world outside had changed forever. The war was over, but the scars it left behind were deep and complicated. For Edeltroud Richtor and the other women who had survived both the battlefield and the American camp, the journey home was not just a return to Germany. It was a step into a future shaped by everything they had learned in the heart of the United States. The process of repatriation was slow and uncertain. The women were transported across the Atlantic, processed through displaced persons camps, and finally released to find what remained of their families and their former lives. But the lessons of Camp Wheeler traveled with them, packed tighter than any suitcase. Each woman carried a new understanding of what it meant to be both a survivor and a witness, a former enemy who had been shown unexpected kindness. For Edeltroud, the transition was especially profound. The memories of American abundance, of meals shared with former enemies, haunted her in the best and worst ways. She found herself unable to accept the old narratives of hatred and division. The simple act of being fed generously without judgment had changed her at the core. She realized that food could be more than sustenance. It could be a bridge, a way to heal wounds that politics and war had left raw. Back in Germany, the reality was harsh. Cities lay in ruins, families were scattered, and hunger was still a daily threat. But Edeltroud was determined to carry forward the lessons she had learned in America. She began to cook for her neighbors, sharing what little she had, refusing to let scarcity turn into cruelty. Her kitchen became a gathering place, a small oasis of warmth and hope in a landscape still marked by loss. Others from Camp Wheeler found their own ways to honor the legacy of their American experience. Wilhelmine opened a soup kitchen in Hamburg, feeding anyone who arrived hungry regardless of their background or beliefs. Kutha returned to teaching, weaving stories of generosity and compassion into her lessons, determined to raise a new generation that would not repeat the mistakes of the past. Elle immigrated to Canada, where she worked with refugee organizations, helping others find safety and dignity in a new land. For Edeltroud, the journey eventually led her back to the United States. In 1965, she opened a small restaurant in Milwaukee, a place she named The Bridge. The menu was a testament to her life's journey, German and American dishes served side by side without hierarchy or judgment. Sauerbraten next to pot roast, apple strudel alongside pumpkin pie, and always the tuna casserole that had first shattered her expectations in Camp Wheeler. The recipe, passed down from Corporal Mills's mother, became a symbol of everything she believed in. That abundance should be shared, that kindness could cross any border, and that even the deepest wounds could be healed around a table. Her children, born in America to a German mother and an American father, grew up hearing the story of Camp Wheeler. They learned that their family's history was complicated, that enemies could become friends, and that the most powerful act of resistance was sometimes as simple as offering seconds. Edeltroud kept the old notebook of recipes, its pages stained and worn, as a reminder of the lessons she had learned in a place she never expected to find hope. The legacy of Camp Wheeler was not just personal, it was a quiet challenge to the world. It asked what might happen if we chose generosity over suspicion, if we saw our enemies as people first, if we believed that even in the darkest times, kindness could be a form of strength. The story of those 28 women and the Americans who fed them became a testament to the power of small acts to change lives, to rewrite histories, and to build bridges where none seemed possible. In the heart of America, far from the front lines, a group of women discovered that the true measure of a nation is not just in its victories, but in its capacity for compassion. The lessons of Camp Wheeler echoed through their lives, shaping families, communities, and even the way history would remember a war that had divided the world. And as Edeltroud served another generous helping of tuna casserole in her Milwaukee restaurant, she knew that the story was not just about the past. It was a promise for the future, a reminder that the bridges we build today can carry us and those who come after us toward a better, more humane tomorrow. In the heart of America, far from the battlefields and bombed-out cities of Europe, a group of women discovered a truth that would echo through generations. The story of Camp Wheeler is not just a footnote in the vast history of World War II, it's a testament to the power of unexpected kindness, the resilience of the human spirit, and the quiet revolutions that can begin with something as simple as a shared meal. For Edeltroud Richtor, the journey from a starving prisoner of war to the owner of a bustling Milwaukee restaurant was more than a personal transformation. It was a living reminder that the lines drawn by conflict are never as permanent as they seem. In the mess hall of an American camp, surrounded by strangers who were supposed to be her enemies, she learned that generosity could be a form of resistance, and that abundance, when shared, could heal wounds deeper than any weapon could inflict. The lessons of Camp Wheeler did not end with the war. They lived on in every recipe Edeltroud passed down, in every meal served at the bridge, in every story told to her children and grandchildren. The faded notebook, filled with American and German recipes written side by side, became a family heirloom, a symbol of the bridges built in a time of division. Each dish was a quiet act of remembrance, a promise that the mistakes of the past would not be forgotten and that the future could be shaped by compassion rather than cruelty. But the story is not just Edeltroud's. It belongs to every person who has ever sat at a table and wondered about the hands that prepared their food, the histories that shaped their meal, the invisible threads that connect us all. It's a story about the American way, not just the abundance of the land, but the generosity of its people, the belief that even in the darkest times there is room for second chances. As the years passed, the world changed, but the lessons of Camp Wheeler remained. In Milwaukee, the aroma of tuna casserole still drifts from the kitchen of the bridge, mingling with laughter and conversation in a place where no one is ever turned away hungry. The restaurant stands as a living memorial, not just to the past, but to the enduring possibility of reconciliation and hope. For those who hear this story, the challenge is clear. What if we chose to see our so-called enemies as people first? What if we measured our strength not by the power to destroy, but by the courage to forgive, to share, to build something new from the ashes of conflict? The answers are not always easy, but the example set in a snowy Wisconsin camp proves that even the smallest acts of kindness can ripple outward, changing lives and shaping history. So the next time you sit down to a meal, whether it's a holiday feast or a simple plate of comfort food, remember the women of Camp Wheeler and the Americans who fed them. Remember that every act of generosity is a chance to build a bridge, to challenge the stories we've been told, and to create a future where abundance is never used as a weapon but always as an invitation. Sometimes, the most powerful act of defiance is a second helping. Sometimes, the greatest legacy is a recipe shared across enemy lines. And sometimes, the true story of America is written not in the headlines of war, but in the quiet moments of humanity that endure long after the guns have fallen silent. The story of Camp Wheeler is a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, the light of compassion can shine through. It's a story worth remembering and one worth living every single day.